In 1974, a researcher at Gombe watched a group of chimpanzees do something that should not have been possible, not because it was physically extraordinary, because it required planning, coordination, deception, and a shared objective executed across multiple individuals over an extended period of time. What she watched was not a fight, it was not a territorial dispute that escalated, it was a patrol. A deliberate, organized, silent patrol into enemy territory with a specific outcome in mind. The field of primatology has never fully recovered from what happened next. Jane Goodall had been studying the chimpanzees of Gombe Stream in Tanzania since 1960. By the early 1970s, she had documented something no researcher had expected to find. A single community of chimpanzees had split into two distinct groups, the Kasakela in the north and the Kahama in the south. The split had happened gradually, over years, as relationships fractured and individuals began spending more time with one subgroup than the other. By 1974, the division was complete. Two communities, two territories, a border between them that both groups understood and respected. And then the Kasakela stopped respecting it. What followed over the next 4 years is known in primatology as the Gombe Chimpanzee War. It is the first documented systematic lethal intergroup aggression in non-human primates. The Kasakela conducted raids into Kahama territory, not opportunistic encounters, not animals that stumbled into each other at a border, organized parties of adult males moving silently into enemy territory, locating isolated Kahama individuals and killing them, one by one, until the Kahama community ceased to exist. 6 adult males, gone, one by one, over 4 years. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what chimpanzee society actually looks like from the inside, because it is more complex, more political, and more deliberately organized than most people know. A chimpanzee community is not a herd, it is not a pack, it is a fission-fusion society, which means the group does not move together as a single unit. Individuals and small subgroups split off and rejoin the larger community constantly, depending on food availability, social relationships, and strategic calculation. At any given time, a chimpanzee knows exactly where it stands in the social hierarchy, who its allies are, who owes it something, and who is a threat. It tracks these relationships across years. It remembers. It plans. The alpha male position in a chimpanzee community is not simply won by being the largest or strongest, it is won through coalition building. A chimpanzee that wants to rise in rank identifies potential allies, invests in those relationships through grooming and food sharing, builds a coalition that can challenge the current alpha, and executes the challenge when the moment is right. This is not instinct, this is politics. Researchers studying chimpanzee power dynamics have described the process using language borrowed directly from political science: alliances, betrayals, strategic patience, the execution of a long-term plan. Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist who spent decades studying chimpanzee social behavior, documented cases of chimpanzees waiting years to exact revenge on a rival who had previously defeated them. Not weeks, years, holding the information, maintaining the relationship network, waiting for the moment when the balance of power shifted enough to act. The chimp that waits 3 years to take down the animal that humiliated it is not acting on instinct, it is acting on memory, calculation, and patience. This is the animal that went to war at Gombe. The raids followed a specific pattern. A party of Kasakela males, typically 4 to 9 individuals, would move to the southern boundary of their territory and then cross it. They moved quietly,
Researchers following them described a visible behavioral shift the moment the group crossed into Kahama territory. Vocalization stopped, movement slowed. The group spread out, maintaining visual contact with each other but increasing the distance between individuals, a formation that maximized their ability to detect threats from multiple directions simultaneously. They were not walking, they were patrolling. When they located a Kahama individual alone, separated from any allies, too far from the core of Kahama territory to receive help in time, they attacked. The attacks were not brief. Researchers who witnessed them described sustained, coordinated violence, multiple attackers holding the victim down while others delivered blows. The attacks continued long past the point of incapacitation. The Kasakela males would then retreat back into their own territory, often traveling in silence for some distance before resuming normal behavior. The first victim was a male named Godi, then Day, then Goliath, an elderly male who had once been the dominant individual in the original unified community, an animal Goodall had known for over a decade, then Charlie, then Sniff, then Hugh. 6 nails, killed individually in coordinated attacks over 4 years. The remaining Kahama females were either killed, absorbed into the Kasakela community, or disappeared. When the last Kahama male was gone, the Kasakela moved south and occupied the former Kahama territory. They now controlled the entire range. Goodall wrote later that what she had witnessed had shaken her more deeply than almost anything else in her career. She had gone to Gombe believing that chimpanzees, while capable of aggression, were fundamentally more peaceful than humans. That violence in chimpanzees was reactive, triggered by immediate threat, not planned. What she witnessed at Gombe forced her to revise that belief completely. She described it as a loss of innocence, not just about chimpanzees, about what the capacity for organized, deliberate, lethal group violence says about where that capacity comes from. Because the Gombe War was not an isolated event. In the 1990s, researchers at Kibale National Park in Uganda began documenting the chimpanzees of Ngogo, a community of unusually large size, over 150 individuals at its peak, significantly larger than most recorded chimpanzee communities. Beginning in 1998 and continuing for a decade, researchers documented 21 lethal raids by the Ngogo community against a neighboring group to their northeast. The pattern was identical to Gombe: organized patrols, silent movement into enemy territory, targeted killing of isolated individuals, systematic elimination of the neighboring community's adult males. By 2009, the Ngogo community had expanded its territory by 22%. The northeastern neighbor had been effectively destroyed as a functioning social unit. The territory it had occupied for decades was now Ngogo territory. John Mitani, one of the lead researchers at Ngogo, published findings describing the raids as the clearest evidence yet that lethal intergroup aggression in chimpanzees is not aberrant behavior. It is a strategy that works. Communities that conduct successful raids acquire more territory, which means more food resources, which means higher survival and reproductive success for community members. The violence is not random. It produces measurable outcomes that benefit the attackers. The question this raises, the question researchers have been careful and contested about for 50 years, is what this means for understanding human warfare. Chimpanzees and humans share 98.7% of their DNA. The common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans lived approximately 6 million years ago. The capacity for organized lethal intergroup aggression appears in both lineages. The logical inference that the capacity was present in the common ancestor and inherited by both species is one researchers have approached with significant caution because the implications are uncomfortable. Richard Wrangham, the Harvard primatologist who has spent decades studying chimpanzee violence, has argued that the evidence points towards what he calls the demonic male hypothesis, that the capacity for organized, premeditated, coalition-based lethal violence is not a human invention, it is a primate inheritance. That when the first human groups conducted raids against neighboring groups, they were not doing something new. They were doing something their ancestors had been doing for millions of years before the species existed. Not everyone agrees. Other researchers argue that the conditions producing chimpanzee intergroup violence, habitat pressure, resource competition, specific demographic imbalances, are not universal enough to support broad conclusions about evolved behavior.
That the Gombe War happened in part because human activity had compressed chimpanzee habitat, increasing resource competition artificially. That Ngogo's unusually large community size created dynamics that don't represent typical chimpanzee behavior. The debate has not been resolved. The data from both Gombe and Ngogo is not contested. The interpretation of what it means is. What is not debated is the behavior itself. The silence of the patrol moving into enemy territory, the spread formation maximizing detection range, the targeting of isolated individuals, the sustained, coordinated attacks, the strategic acquisition of territory following successful campaigns. These are documented, repeated, observed across multiple sites, across decades, by multiple independent research teams. The chimpanzees of Ngogo did not stumble into conflict. They prosecuted a 10-year campaign with a consistent strategy that produced a specific territorial outcome. The researchers who documented it spent years deciding how to describe what they had seen. Some of them are still deciding. The forest at Ngogo is quiet now. The northeastern territory that belonged to another community for decades is empty of its original inhabitants. The Ngogo chimpanzees move through it without incident. They know every tree. They learned the boundaries of this new land the same way they learned the boundaries of the last one, by removing everyone who knew it differently.